Yes, I do. Thanks, and thanks very much for inviting me to what's been an incredibly interesting afternoon. And you've collected a really nice mix of speakers with a really interesting set of topics. So congratulations, and it was a very sort of enjoyable way to spend the afternoon. Um, I thought what I'd do is two things. One is a very quick, elevator pitch. So if I was asked in the elevator, well, what did you hear this afternoon? I thought I'd just run through sort of the key things that I took away from each speaker, and then reflect on one or two of the sort of connecting themes. But I'll try and do it relatively quickly so that we can have a chance to discuss. So elevator pitch. Well, if you ask me, well, what did I take away this afternoon? Just running through the speakers. So Sarah number two, whose surname I think is Kavan, I think the most interesting thing that I took away from that was that the point she made about how finance is now coming at this ESG challenge and innovation from both ends. So we've always had sort of people who are interested in impact finance, but now we've got coming from the mainstream side. For the first time, really, investors across the board are showing really significant interest in ESG and driving that. John highlighted the scale of the challenge. He gave us a good example of progress, which of course I was connected with. So thank you, John, on the tailings standard. He also gave us a good example of how we slipped up and dropped the ball last year with Juukan Gorge. And I think he made an important point about how we need to think about the whole supply chain, not just the mining end. Given the fact that so much is going through China and so much is being processed in China, we need to think holistically about responsible supply. Sarah, number three, whose surname I think is Weber. The most important point I think I took away from that was that, which is so often forgotten, especially by junior companies, is the need to budget both time and investment in relationships. And I'd like to come back to one other point that she made when I sort of talk about the sort of connecting themes. Remy, I think, gave us a very good concrete example of how to do that, how to invest time and money in managing those kind of relationships. Nick gave us an example of where there's room for progress on tailings, and I think the point that he made on media was interesting. How the media picked he had claimed that the tailings were toxic, which was you could argue it either way depending on how you define toxicity, I guess. But I think more importantly, as he said, bad news travels faster. We just need to make sure we have far less bad news in our industry if we're to regain our reputation. Carly talked about product stewardship, and there was a little bit of angst, I think, in terms of the number of different standards that she's having to deal with, and perhaps it's incumbent on us. And John did sort of query whether governments were playing a proper role, perhaps on governments as well, to play a role in consolidation of some of those standards. Catherine talked about the Sazani social license to operate model and how to visualize it depending whether you like colors, numbers, or diagrams. And I thought the integrated model was very nice. And hopefully you'll get some volunteers to collaborate with you on the next steps there. Aileen talked about, I may have got the pronunciation wrong there, but I think you talked about a critically important subject. And it's not just, by the way, important to get right, but it has been demonstrated through evidence, concrete evidence, that if you can get your diversity and inclusion right on teams, you can be more productive. So, the message is completely aligned with delivering a better bottom line, whether it's a single bottom line or triple bottom line. But there's no disputing the evidence there. And I think you also made a very important point, which is about how we need to have respect for each other, and that's at the heart of it. And I think that translates across into more than just inclusion and diversity. And then Rob, last but not least, you made a compelling case for measuring the social return as well as the investment return, and how how if you can make that case and demonstrate it, it's sort of linked to lowering the risk for investors. I think your quote about managing what you measure is well taken. And I think you also perhaps highlighted some of the complexity of getting that right. That to me is the fascination of the sector. And so just a few of the sort of overarching themes which I drew out of that. The first one is the interconnectedness of everything we've been talking about today, just to pick up on one or two of the points that came up on tailings. We learned this going through the development of the standard. Previous attempts at managing tailings have been very sort of technically focused. The independent panel came at this from a very different angle, and they said this has got to be people-centered. And for the first time, environmental and social considerations were introduced into a tailings management standard at the global level. But what was also interesting was the investors were, at the table as well, and investors were driving this. And this was the first time that investors had shown so much interest in, and wanted to get their hands dirty, basically, in how this industry is managing its business, which is an illustration of how their reputations are on the line as well, and they feel that. And Yukon Gorge is also an example of that, because some of the lessons coming out of that are about how the decision making needs to be much more integrated, and how companies need to get much better at transmitting critical information upwards, and sifting information, which is critical, which isn't. This needs to go up, this doesn't. And those lessons were also very evident in Brumadinho. And then the other thing about interconnection was how the decarbonisation agenda is being driven by ESG, but at the same time we have to get the ESG right. So there's a sort of circularity there. I think your question, John, about whether governments are focused enough is right there. Governments need to help us through this. The private sector has been leading on a lot of these topics, but governments, I think, need to play a bit of catch up. And I think some of the points that Sarah made on social license, to do with the potential for shared value and the importance of context, are also, point to the interconnectedness of everything we do. And I think Rob's just been speaking to that as well. And then the second theme is, which is related to interconnectedness, but not quite the same, is complexity. We've had so many different standards mentioned just in 3 hours today. LME, OECD, ISO, GRI, ICMM, and then of course the alphabet soup that Rob mentions in terms of evaluating the SRI. And there is a clear need for consolidation. There was a question asked about which ministries sign off on social license to operate. There's a clear need for consolidation, a clear need for governments, and maybe some kind of supranational entity to, if it doesn't exist already, to be created to oversee some of this, because we're facing a critical challenge in the next 10 years, and we can't just leave everyone to muddle through. And then the final point to make was that there was very much through the afternoon an emphasis on the S in ESG, the social aspects, not just communities, but rightly so, an emphasis on Indigenous peoples, the need for engagement, co-ownership, alignment, and the point that was made about when you engage with Indigenous people, a need for an honest, open, consistent approach is well made, but it's also incredibly difficult, because when you're an explorer and you're going in there, you don't really know what you found. You don't know whether you're looking at a 10-year asset, a 100-year asset. You can't be completely open and honest because you don't really know what you've got. You're having to explain very difficult concepts, and then suddenly your junior gets acquired and hands change, and all of a sudden the Indigenous community is dealing with a completely new entity. And I think so. One of the points that I think I would make in reflection on that is the need for kind of induction, onboarding when you change hands like that, but also really good record keeping, really good handover of relationships, the really sort of real importance to of managing expectations. And it comes back, just to finish off, it comes back to the point Aileen made about respect for each other, and that's so critical in the way we engage with Indigenous people, and we've got it wrong so many times. And basic respect for each other. It's almost like you're in a marriage, but one partner gets changed out every 5 years. And how can you manage a relationship like that, where the Indigenous people, the community is there all the time, but suddenly the company changes, you've got a new partner. We saw that in Juukan Gorge. The PKKP got really upset, having been told, well, this person's going to deal with your relationship now, only to see after a few months that the company shipped that person off to Mongolia or somewhere else, I think, and they're starting again. And I think we've got to get that right. So that's my summary. I hope I've left enough time for a quick discussion. Sarah number one.
I think we're all equal in terms of the numbers here, Tom. But Tom, thank you so much for that summary. That was absolutely fantastic. And the messages I'm getting behind the scenes are just saying, wow, this is a brilliant summary. So thank you very, very much, Tom. I think kind of building on what you've said there in terms of that interconnectedness, the complexity. How do you hand over what you've been building up, but then also as well build and maintain that trust? And something with regards to that, and it's almost inspired by Aileen's talk, which is how do you know when to actually ask somebody else for something? So it's a case of we all know our space really well. And we sometimes make the assumption that somebody else understands our space also. And so we're constantly saying, hey, here, I've got this tool. But actually, what do we need from other people to make our stuff work, if that makes sense? So it's that two-way discussion. So what I was going to suggest is maybe if we go around our panel, and Tom, I'm going to come straight back to you first, and then maybe we can go to Catherine after that and say, if there was one thing that you could ask of somebody else in this stakeholder interconnected map to say, I really would like this from you, because that will help me do my job. And sorry, Tom, I know that I'm landing this on you without any preparation in advance. What would that be that would make your life easier to be able to push forwards with the objectives you're trying to achieve? So what can we give to you to make your life easier?
Well, it's easy for me to answer that because I don't have a job right now, having just left my job. So, but I think Aileen would probably have some good points to make to this. But I think that I think a few people have made the point that you've got to be ready and willing to take the time, and so often we don't. So often we come, especially I'm an engineer, you come to the table, you assume a level of knowledge and understanding which is just not there. You've just got to take the time and be willing to slow down, sometimes a lot. And actually some companies have been incredibly successful when they've been willing to slow down. The classic example being Anglo with Quellaveco, where they had lost their social license and they just came back to the community and said, look, we understand we've got this completely wrong. We're willing to take as much time as is needed. We don't, if it needs 2 years, we'll take 2 years. And then I think the second point, which I think Aileen made, maybe not using the same words, but you've got to be willing to be vulnerable and and be sort of open to the fact that you don't have all the answers. The answers are sort of produced collaboratively.
Fantastic. Thanks for that, Tom. So time and willingness to be vulnerable. Catherine, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Nick.
Yeah, I think I probably agree with Tom, to be honest. I think that it is about having a space that feels safe to ask questions. Even if there is time, that space needs to be safe. You need to not be judged. And I think that's really, really important. And I think also then just it's a bit of a diversion, but it was mentioned in one of the other, so I think in the session that I was involved in earlier in the week, the importance of, if commitments are made with projects, that those commitments stay with the project and they don't stay with the investor, or they don't stay with the mining company, because we all know how many times projects go through hands, and I think that breaks that chain of trust completely, because whether it be something sort of small like a day off, or some that's related to something happening, or it's something huge in terms of a commitment. The commitments tend to get forgotten as projects change hands. So, and I think having a safe space there as well to be able to challenge decisions, and not just to accept a decision because that decision is made. And in my other world that I live in, the notion of critical thinking, which is, I think, slowly seeping into the mining sector, but being able to sort of to make informed decisions by looking at a range of different perspectives. So I think that's the chain. That's what I'd like, that space for that critical thinking, and looking at things from different perspectives.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Catherine. Nick, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Carly.
Yeah, no, I'm going to answer from a more technical point of view, and maybe more related to the theme of last year's conference than this one. But I'm a petrologist who finds himself in the world of seismologists, and what I'm finding is the communication is difficult. We speak different languages, and it's rather hard to bridge this gap. Now, what we're doing, we're moving into monitoring of tailings dams, and then we have to speak to the engineers, the people who construct the dams, and getting the information, working out how we can, what we do is we measure seismic velocity, and how do we relate that to the material in the dams and how it's behaving during deformation or seepage. This is a real problem. So it's the old problem. How do you break down the silos? How do you communicate between one another? And there's specific response to your question is, I need to get information from engineers to solve the problems we're trying to address right now.
Brilliant. So I need your information, engineers, but also in a way that I can actually understand it and use it. So brilliant. Thanks for that, Nick. Carly, how about yourself? And then we'll go to John.
Yeah, kind of going with what Nick said there, passing on that information from generation to generation as well, and making sure that young people such as myself have opportunities to learn and to grow within the industry and stay within the industry. That's the main goal, right?
Yeah, no, brilliant. Give me the opportunity to grow. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Carly. John, how about yourself? And then we'll go to Aileen.
So two quick things. One, the whole concept of the relationship between an exploration company and, say, an Indigenous community. When I do due diligence, which I do periodically with other companies, a significant amount of our time is spent worrying about the pre-existing relationships. And yet, I, as a geologist, don't have tools to assess that, particularly if you're doing it, a 2-day visit to a new area to assess a project, and you're being asked to understand what the quality of the relationships are. I mean, it's impossible. So I need help, huge help, to think through that whole exercise. And the second piece around relationships, and it comes back to Aileen again, which is fantastic, your talk. What fascinates me is this whole human psychology part of it, this question, the whole nature of bias and human bias, and it touches everything, our personal relationships, and the way we mistreat other people, which is outrageous. And a quick shout out for a great movie, Picture a Scientist. If you haven't seen Picture a Scientist, it's a fantastic movie that is an absolute eye-opener, wake-up call for all of us. But anyway, aside from that, I want to understand human psychology. So I want to understand cognitive and all the biases. And it's not just the personal relationships, although they are enormous, it affects all our technical work as well. Geologists, geoscientists are rife with biases that we don't really understand or realize, and it affects our decisions. So it's not just the personal ones, which are very, very important. It's also our ability to do our best jobs that we need to understand human psychology. So I want a human psychologist in my, somewhere back here just to tell me what the hell's going on.
Luckily, John, one of the biases that geologists have is optimism.
Yeah, well, I have that in spades.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, John. And I concur. The Picture a Scientist movie, please do go and watch it. It is fantastic. And thank you very much, Aileen, for making that available during your conference as well. So Aileen, let's come across to yourself, and then we'll go to a triplet of Sarahs. We'll go to Sarah Webber first, and then Sarah Caven.
Also, yes, I probably should have mentioned that Crag sponsored a screening of Picture a Scientist as like an icebreaker style event. And I just wanted to mention, Tom, yes, you did get my name right. It's all good. But I think one of the biggest things for my own perspective anyway is that really helps make things like EDIG and just kind of these conversations possible is support. So I didn't get to go into it in that much detail, but the way EDIG actually started was that because of our annual conference, we went to a virtual platform. The suggestion for hosting a workshop at it on unconscious bias moved to our EDI committee, and there our director Maria Hitzman was just incredibly supportive, and like this was only ever meant to be like a conversation and things like that, but he was just like extremely supportive and was like, no, we need to do this. And it was really useful because he's kind of an example of someone higher up that often represents a lot of people, and they were kind of the type of people we're trying to target and bring into the conversation. So his support was massively helpful in that, and it also brought a lot of other people who didn't really see themselves in the conversation to take part. And I think that's a really big thing, because there's a lot of people still with these events that will send an email if it's at some conferences where they say, what's the point of that? That's not needed here. And it's kind of shows that it is needed here, but it's also really discouraging for the people organizing them when they get an email saying you've no place here. So just be a bit considerate, I think, of the words you're using and the like comments that you're sending to people, because there are real people behind these. It might be like a Twitter account or something, but there's people that run them. And I think kind of everyone's touched on this a little bit, but just be open to learning and your own unconscious biases. And I really think while we came at this from initially a gender-based perspective, there was just so many marginalized communities that I was so, I guess, unaware of myself, and it really shook me how much I didn't know about all the people in my life. And when I think back on it now, I'm a bit more aware of the things that have happened, like going on field trips in undergrad where you don't know what the schedule is, so because of whatever reason someone can't come on that trip because they didn't know what was involved, and they have to sit in a van all day. And that's really easy to deal with if you just think about planning in advance. And also a really big thing, I think, is for everyone to look at their own privileges and see what advantages they might have over someone else, because you might fall into a minoritized category, but you might also have massive benefits and privileges that another group might not. So I think it's just about looking at ourselves and not getting angry or defensive or anything like that, because really this is a learning journey we're all meant to be taking part in, and it's okay to make mistakes. I have made quite a lot of them, and they've all been recorded on camera and on YouTube. So it's just about, I think, re-emphasizing what the word I forgot to use about creating a safe space where we don't judge each other and we're just open to having these conversations and starting to take action.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Aileen. And yes, I can sympathise in terms of all those mistakes being captured on camera for everybody to see. No, you're fantastic, lovely lady. All good. So moving from diversity to a total lack of diversity, i.e. 3 ladies who look very similar and all have the same first name. So I don't know what that means between us. So Sarah Wemmer, let's come to yourself first, and then we'll go to Sarah Caven.
I think the comment I'd like to leave with is for people to understand within their own projects of their timelines. And I think Tom touched on this a bit, but that exploration can be very uncertain, but there is some certainty. Geoscientists, as an exploration example, are testing a deposit model. There's certain information they need to, advance that project. Then you know what your timeline is. So aligning your permitting, your community agreements and engagement along those lines in a holistic fashion when you're planning your project, I think is something that's very achievable. And that's something that continues on through the entire life cycle of a project. So if you can think, okay, what is the legacy of this project? And in exploration, sometimes it's that you leave it behind and 5 groups later, somebody picks it up and finds something that you missed. But it's about managing expectations, those uncertainties, but and planning for success and also planning for failure or an exit. So how are you entering this project and how are you leaving it, and what's that flow chart of information look like? So I think there's thinking about it in a whole life cycle fashion is how I try to approach it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Sarah. On to the next, Sarah.
Thanks. So many great comments already. I think I would just add, for me, I love the comment that Elaine made about being able to make mistakes. So this idea of a willingness to have dialogue and get around the same table, even if it's uncomfortable, as opposed to, sort of maybe ESG risk or something else, just precluding engagement or preventing engagement. I think that's so important. What I've found in many of my discussions more recently on the investment side and the impact investing side, when you say, hey, can I have a chat with you about mining or artisanal mining, people initially are quite often, not interested. But when you dig into it and you start telling the story and you start, highlighting the impact and the importance of the sector and of mining at large, some people open up to the idea. So how do we better capitalize on those conversations? How do we tell the stories of the innovators and the trailblazers and start to really move the needle forward? Both from the ESG perspective, but also, as I mentioned, like how do we actually embed these values in the core of the business model?
Brilliant. Embedding it in the core of the business model. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. I think we could probably carry on speaking for a lot longer, but I won't take any more time of your day, apart from just a quick advert for the final session of this year's conference, which happens tomorrow morning UK time. So I'm really sorry, Team Canada and the Americas, in the middle of your night, but you will be able to catch it in a similar style to the EDIG conference, all on YouTube, because it's all being recorded there with all of our wonderful opportunities that we're encountering. That's me trying to say mistakes in a nice way, Aileen, and I am crashing and burning with regards to that at the moment. So what do we have tomorrow morning? We're going to kick off with a very quick interview on the satellite stuff, and I will be sending an email introducing Heather and Gareth to talk satellites and remote sensing immediately after we finish this today, because I think that co-creation and learning together will be brilliant. So we kick off with some satellites. We then go to Ellie Vin, who's going to give us a talk on transforming Malawi's low value stones into multi-million dollars. So I'm really looking forward to this talk, and don't feel like you need to dial in live, but please do catch it online later. We then go to Francesca Santinelli, who I met a couple of years ago working in the DRC, and she's going to talk about, and I think this title is brilliant, it's called Brittany, yeah, that Brittany goes to the DRC. I think that's fantastic as a title. I want to watch it. Well, I will obviously be there. So really looking forward to that tomorrow from Francesca. Then we've got Andy Purvis, who's going to be bringing in some of the biodiversity into the mix. So talking about developing metrics to monitor biodiversity risk in mining operations. Then on to Veer, and they're going to talk about DNA-based methods for mine state biodiversity monitoring, a global approach. So, yeah, so today we had quite a lot of social. Tomorrow we've got quite a lot of biodiversity going on, which would be great. Then we've got Louis Marchand from the OECD, then Jamie Strauss with Digby. So if you haven't come across Digby yet, really tune into Jamie's spiel, because they've got a really good way of bringing together mining companies and the investors, with ESG being that linking space. So we've got Jamie, then into Jeff Townsend and Kirsty Benham, who are going to talk about the Critical Minerals Association. So this is a fairly new group that was set up within the last 18 months that helps the mining community to engage with the British government. So a huge amount of discussion has been going on over the last 12 months. And as we heard from our politician, Alexander Stafford, this morning, this time last year, nobody was talking about critical minerals in government. Nobody was talking about mining. Now they are all beginning to talk about it, which is really exciting. And a lot of that is thanks to Jeff and Kirsty and what they've been doing with the Critical Minerals Association. And then finally, to help us wrap up, we draw on the skills of Dan Smith, so academic, but who's also worked on the policy and the politics side of mining and minerals, and he spent a lot of time on the mines as well. So Dan is going to help us draw things together with common ground and sustainability hot topics. So an action-packed final session for us tomorrow. Thank you so much to our lovely panelists today, and thank you to everybody who stayed tuned in. You are all beautiful, you are all wonderful. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.
Well done, Sarah.